All right, good morning, everybody. My name's Sam Rosen. I'm from Temple University. And so I guess let's keep this NFT discussion going. So I'm here, I want to talk about social goods. So when you think about, or when I say the term social goods, you may think about things like luxury handbags or high-end sports cars or fine art. These are assets whose values are heavily driven by social components. But despite the prevalence of social goods in our daily lives, or the frequency with which we encounter them, we don't really understand them that well. Particularly, we don't really understand how they emerge, kind of which brands or companies ultimately end up being the successful ones. For example, why is Rolex and Ferrari the ones we know today versus their similar competitors that at some point faded into obscurity? In this paper, we propose to use the non-fungible token, or NFT market, as a laboratory for studying social goods. NFTs, as I'm sure many people in this audience know, we're talking about digital assets. In this study in particular, we're going to be focusing on NFTs who are associated with either digital artwork or collectibles. And so why is this market good to study? And as exampled on the slide here. So why is this market the ideal setting to study social goods? It really comes down to data. So we happen to be fortunate to live in a time where we actually get to observe NFTs kind of emerge on the scene as this new type of digital asset class. And that meant that we were able to, unlike with in the case of Ferrari or Rolex or those types of companies, we're actually able to see all of the NFT collections that launched, including the ones that didn't end up being successful. And you combine that with the rich transaction level data of the blockchain, and we're able to paint a very clear picture of what exactly is going on in the NFT market. So what do we do in this paper is we essentially take a social goods theory model and we test all of the predictions of this model, whether or not they hold in the NFT market. And the long story short is that they all do. And this starts where we look at the primary market for NFT collection launches. And one of the first things we see is that there's clear evidence of herding, right? So we see that the outcomes, whether or not these collections are able to sell their items, they either sell out entirely or they sell very poorly. And in fact, during NFT collection sales, we see evidence of momentum and acceleration where successful collections begin to sell out faster towards the end of the sale. So these outcomes are certainly consistent with social goods theories and the associated mechanisms, but there's still one important alternative hypothesis that we need to consider, which is that maybe the herding we observe is actually informational, right? Maybe it's just the market learning which NFT collections are the good ones versus which ones aren't. And here we employ an instrumental variables analysis, where we're able to show that shocks to the very early initial success of an NFT collection launch, those early shocks actually have really persistent effects on the collection up to 6 months later. And this is something that you would expect to see for a good whose value is driven heavily by social value, not so much for a good or for the informational herding story. So these forces and these mechanisms that create herding in the primary market, they also lead to substantial underpricing in the primary market. And one of the things that we show that's particularly important for our story is that we argue that this underpricing is not due to compensation for risk, as one might expect. So we're able to show this in a few ways, but a related piece of evidence, which also supports the same notion, is the idea that we actually see the activity and the significant activity by scalpers in the NFT market who actually exploit this underpricing to buy and then flip in the secondary market. And once again, this is something you'd expect to see in a social good market. All right, so where does this leave us? Well, if you're already inclined to believe that NFTs are social goods, or if at least if you're willing to believe that, then you can view the contribution of our study as really validating that the social goods theory, these predictions hold empirically, right? And we're relatively unique in our ability to do that given the clear data advantage in this market. Now, if on the other side, you, let's say, believed in social goods theory, well, then one takeaway from our study is that our comprehensive set of evidence paints a pretty convincing case that you should think about NFTs as being social goods. All right, so that's the paper in a nutshell. And for the remainder of my time, I'm going to provide some more details as well as show you some interesting figures. All right, so just a quick recap on NFTs. Digital assets held in blockchain wallets, and as the name suggests, they are both unique and indivisible on the blockchain. That's their non-fungible nature. I mentioned earlier that we focus on a type of NFT that's associated with either digital artwork or collectibles. We also focus on a type that happens to be sold in NFT collections in the primary market. And so just as a very tangible example, here's a collection called Subducts. It's a relatively successful collection that was launched in 2021. And you can see from these pictures that we're talking about, or at least each of the individual NFTs is associated with a digital image of a different cartoon duck with various features. All right, and there's really not that, as I think as the previous paper also got at, there's not much to NFTs aside from what you see here. No cash flows or other clear tangible benefits. All right, so why do people buy NFTs then? Well, when you look at it, it's really hard to not argue that they are heavily socially driven in nature. And I think one of the first examples you can get to think about this is just look at one of their main kind of use cases, at least in practice, has been as profile pictures on various social media platforms. A way to credibly show off that you have an NFT from a given collection. Okay, so these collections are sold in primary markets in sets of 5 to 10,000. It's really important for us, actually, that these are sold and the actual NFT is created as part of the sale, because this actually allows us to understand how successful the sale was in terms of actually selling out the items to the intended public. And these sales are advertised well in advance, right? Another kind of piece of anecdotal evidence that suggests their social nature is that they have to be kind of hyped up in advance and even to before the launch. Okay, and then after the launch, they're traded on platforms as we were just talking about in the previous paper. Or sorry, we're talking about borrowing, but anyway, we talked about Blur a little bit there as well. Okay, so the paper as a whole social goods model, which I'm gonna mostly skip over, but there's two things I want to highlight here. One thing is I wanted to show you, at least in a formal mathematical way, what I mean when I talk about social goods. So at the top here, we have the utility function for a given NFT. And what makes it a social good in our model is this first term right here. So the second term is some sort of benefit from the quality of the art or the quality of the collection. But this first term here, this first, the row, is a parameter that we assume is positive. It's a term that captures that you value something more if other people also demand it. So this N is a measure of how many other people wanted to also purchase the NFT from the given collection in the model. All right, so assuming that this row is positive makes it a good that has a social component of demand. And all of the key predictions of the model come precisely from making this term positive and introducing a social component of demand. And what key predictions am I talking about here? Well, the two key predictions are that outcomes are bimodal in the primary market. Either collections completely sell out or they don't. And then on the related note, the issuer who sells this collection deliberately underprices it, in part so that the collection will definitely sell out. Basically, this social effect on demand introduces essentially a kink point around certain prices where in order for a collection to be demanded at all, it has to be actually over-demanded, which from the perspective of an outsider looks like it was underpriced, even though it's optimal from the issuer's perspective. All right, so now we have the model predictions. We're going to go ahead and take a look at them in the data. And so from the data side of things, we take a very comprehensive look at the NFT market. We have over almost 5,700 collections of these, we call them generative collections because they meet these certain characteristics. It's about 27 million NFTs. All right, we get all the data. Okay. So this is a picture of the primary market outcomes for these collection launches. So the x-axis is a measure of how many NFTs the collection sold relative to how many it wanted to sell. And so visually, the bimodality is striking. We see that about a third of collections sell out entirely. Meanwhile, the other two-thirds sell very little and effectively fail. Right? And this is a big deal because if you want your collection to be successful, you have to be successful in the primary market in order to eventually become a successful collection in the secondary market. Right? And it's very hard to predict with any sort of X, A, and T characteristics which part of the distribution a given collection is going to be on. All right, and so we show evidence of acceleration and such, but let me move on here. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that one key challenge for us is to separate the idea, or at least can we distinguish between social and informational herding. So social herding, which you could also call preference-driven herding, is herding driven by the idea that we see other people want it, so we want that good as well. Really, that fits into our utility. That's what the model says. Right, but under the informational story, right, you may just figure out that an item's good based on observing other people who purchased it. So how can we distinguish this? So we take a cue from some other papers in the literature, and we use as a shock to collection launch success, we used a measure of realized Bitcoin variability during the first hour of the collection's launch. Right, so the second the collection goes up for sale and people can start buying it, we measure Bitcoin variability during that same time period. Right, and I'm up here telling you about this analysis, so it's not surprising that it ends up working, that we find that this instrument is indeed relevant as an instrument for collection primary market success. And then when we instrument for primary market success using this variability, we find that we can predict measures of collection trading volume, both number of trades, as well as even to the extensive margin that's trading, up to 6 months after. And this is just not something that you would expect to find if this was an informational story, right? This is something that is instead perfectly consistent with a preference-driven story where these types of shocks can have these really long, persistent effects on collection outcomes. All right, so all right, we document the substantial underpricing. Just the aggregate amount is just giant. It's on the order of 100 percentage points. We see that returns to trades that were bought in the primary market and then sold earn way more than those that are purchased and sold in the secondary market. Right, so this underpricing almost seems like a puzzle on its surface. We're able to show this very formally in our regression setting as well. And I mentioned earlier that this could just be compensation for risk, right? This is something we saw in the initial coin offering market as well, that you'd see these really high initial returns. But when we study the actual returns to the agents who engage in this type of trading, basically buying in primary market sales and selling, basically it's hard to see much risk in this trading strategy. Right? Instead, what we see is a trading strategy that is maybe hard to scale up, but is very not risky when you look at the actual trade level returns. Right? And it's for this reason that we actually see the emergence, and we can see them very clearly in our data, these scalper agents whose, I'll call, business model seems to essentially be participating in primary market sales and then flipping in secondary markets and just taking advantage of this substantial underpricing. So we do a pretty detailed analysis of their behavior and their returns. And bottom line is they look like scalpers and they do outperform others, but only through their scalping strategy. All right. So I'm just about out of time, so I'm just going to mention maybe two kind of implications of our study. One is that I think looking at NFTs from a social goods perspective, suddenly you see NFT issuers in a different light because what seemed like, I'll call it irrational underpricing, suddenly makes a lot more sense when you view it from a social goods perspective. That's one thing. And also this talks about how challenging it is to actually solve the scalper problem, and if it's something that really can be meaningfully solved in this type of market. And then the other thing I want to point out is that a lot of times when you see people talk about NFT returns, those returns are actually blending primary market and secondary market returns. So just in terms of talking about the asset class as a whole, our study helps demonstrate why we should consider primary and secondary market returns separately to understand the asset class. All right, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Questions for Mark? I'm sorry, Sam. Oh, yeah.
Hi. Really interesting talk. Just two questions. One, thinking a bit about scalpers. Can we think of this as compensation for providing liquidity? I mean, they're willing to take it on until they're willing to find a buyer who can accept it at the valuation. And second, what about like Keynes' greater fool theory? I buy an NFT just because I believe that socially people will demand it tomorrow, not because I actually care about myself. Like I care about the resale value, not just my consumption benefit of holding it.
Okay, so I guess I'll start with the second question because I feel like it touches on a little bit of the theme from the previous talk, the idea that, now with hindsight, these were silly, right? These pictures, like why did anyone buy these? Why did anyone think they had value? And I think I ultimately have come away with a different take after spending time in the study and thinking about it, where, not all fads have to be cool forever. Right, we have these days Labubu dolls are kind of more in fashion, if you will, right? But the idea that NFTs were meant to both come and be a staying power forever, or at least in their current form, I thought was never kind of what they were meant to be. So I think the kind of, you call it maybe the greater fool aspect, I almost feel like the idea that they're eventually not going to become interesting anymore is kind of part of their deal. Although that being said, I guess this is also an excuse to bring up another thing I learned by doing this study is that if you actually look at the kind of current status of the NFT market, and I have a slide in here, but it's maybe at this point about a year old, relative to I think the popular perception of how much the NFT market has died, it's much more alive than you might think it is. And in particular, like over half of the value of, from a market cap perspective comes from like the top 5 collections. And they're the collections that now these days we all, we know Bored Apes, we know CryptoPunks, right? So they've kind of made it into the cultural landscape, if you will. And in some sense, that's what's so interesting about studying kind of NFTs in this period of time is we got to see this formation period, if you will. And now you kind of have these legacy collections that are still out there. But as we talked about before, maybe the nature of NFTs is shifting over time. But I think there's always going to be a place for this type of status art social NFT.
Okay, there is a question from Ariel.
Thanks, Sam. Interesting talk. One of the things the last speaker, Mark, brought up is, cycles seem to repeat in crypto very frequently. So I'm curious about the role of the indivisibility of the asset in your model as a social good. And, I'm thinking specifically about meme coins also as social goods. And is there anything particular about the indivisible nature of it that matters? Because I think if you look at meme coins, you see very similar patterns of underpricing on the bonding curve, and then they sell out on the bonding, and then suddenly prices collapse. And, flippers who get in early make a lot of money. People who get in slightly late tend to lose a lot of money. So I wonder if you see analogs or if there is something really special about the NFT itself.
So I think it's a great question. I think on the second side of things, whether or not the indivisibility is important, I don't really think so. I think, at the end of the day, I don't think it's as important. I mean, it's helpful from a data perspective to be able to obviously track things and ownership and such, but I don't think it's the most crucial aspect. And I guess I'd also say I agree with you that I think there is a lot of parallels between what we're doing, the theory, and also meme stocks as well. And I think sometimes that discussion can be a little more challenging because, you look at, GameStop or these things, and you think, okay, there is fundamental value, right? There's no fundamental value to the duck pictures in the same way. But I think the same kind of aspect of the way the social forces can affect the dynamics, I do think there is a lot of parallels with meme stocks. And actually, that's something I've been thinking about for future projects as well.
Thank you. Any other questions? I had some actually questions about that bimodal figure you showed. It was really interesting. So it reminded me a social contagion model we use for understanding how influence propagates in a network, something called linear threshold model. There as well, the model is basically you do something if more than a fraction of your friends do it.
Yeah.
And then we see this bimodal thing. It's either some new innovation, some new product never kicks off, or everybody wants it. Is there any connection or similar pictures maybe from other markets you have seen that you can find analogies with?
So I think on the mechanism side of thing, I think that's exactly the same story as what's going on here, right? This social effect of demand creates this multiple equilibrium situation where we use global games approach for equilibrium selection, but it is very much that same story. And then whether or not we've seen this in other settings, I would say that if we could measure in other markets, I would expect to see things very, very similar to this. But as I mentioned at the beginning, if you wanted to look at even, luxury, even wines or other things or artists, right? You're not going to be able to generate this picture just because that primary market is so much, you don't necessarily have the full picture in the other settings. But I'd imagine it would look like this.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, there's another question.
So I think there was an earlier question for an earlier talk about NFTs for practical objects as well. And they don't demonstrate the same kind of market dynamics that we see with Bored Apes and Pick Your Favorite Ducks thing. How much of what you see is a reflection of the intrinsic value of the object versus the NFT interface for that object, or some combination of the two?
So I think on this, I think building off of Ariel's question as well, I definitely don't think it has anything to do with the non-fungible nature of it, or even the token or smart contract nature. I think I'm careful, or I think when we write the paper, and especially present to an audience like this, I'm careful to be clear when I talk about NFTs. I mean the specific type of NFTs, and obviously these days there's more coming out, or there's nothing about the technology that limits it to this particular type. But I think that being said, the reason why if you tokenized other assets and looked at them trade, you wouldn't see things like this is because really I think it is the social aspect of their value that is why we see the outcomes the way we are. And at least that's, I think, what our whole paper is trying to convince you. So if we've done that, then that's a success.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Let's thank Sam one more time.